Welcome to the Healing Grove podcast. I'm Dr. Kristin, an integrative holistic family physician, author of Life After Lyme, and host in this virtual space of learning, healing, and growing. I believe humans are like trees, and our physical limb is only one of many. Health on all limbs of the tree, emotional, conceptual, social, spiritual, is absolutely required for the whole tree that is you to be vibrantly well. I created the Healing Grove podcast as a place to showcase some of the world's best integrative and holistic medicine, to expose you to transformative tools and mindset shifts for all limbs of your tree. I hope you enjoy our conversation in the Healing Grove today as much as I enjoyed having it. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to introduce to you today my friend, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Dr. Stephanie Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory there in Cambridge, Mass. She's been there her whole academic career. She got her bachelor's from MIT in biology, her master's, EE, and PhDs from MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. She's published over 200 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals and conference proceedings. And her recent interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and human disease, with a very special emphasis on the pervasive herbicide Roundup and the mineral sulfur. And we're going to get a lot into the sulfur situation today, I think, Stephanie. Her investigations have led to a strong hypothesis that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, is the key factor in the autism epidemic and in many other neurological, metabolic, oncological, and autoimmune diseases. And in just the past few years, she's authored over 30 peer-reviewed journal papers on these topics and has delivered numerous slide presentations around the world. She's currently writing a book on glyphosate that will hopefully be released in 2020. And I'm excited to hear more about that towards the end of our talk. She's also going to provide us with some suggestions for what to do. So before we get into your story, I just want to provide the little cautionary note for listeners. I know some of you out there get freaked out when you hear about all the toxins in our world. I want you to kind of just get really centered and sort of create a little protective bubble around yourself, because you're going to hear some things that are a little bit scary. And we're going to end with some really hopeful suggestions and very actionable steps that you can take to protect yourself. Make sense? Awesome. So Stephanie, you're really kind of like a Renaissance woman. You've had this whole career in computational technology and, figuring out how to have human beings and computers talk to each other and something like that, or computers sound like humans, and a ton of research in that area, and then really shifted your focus. And from what I can understand, you aren't a person who had her own health journey to that kind of crisis and then learning. You really took a different path. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your story and what brought you to this, your current area of interest.
Yeah, it's true that I'm not one of those people who has suffered from a great deal of health issues that have driven me to figure it out, which of course many people are, and I understand that, and I really appreciate what they're doing. I did have an experience back in early 1980s with my best friend at the time had a son who developed autism following a vaccine. So he got an HPV vaccine and ran a high fever. He was crying uncontrollably. And a week later, he had seizures, and then he was later diagnosed with autism. So I sort of planted a seed way back then to sort of watch autism and watch vaccines. So that was kind of came to a head around 2006 when I was seeing the autism rates going up exponentially. And so much, the research dollars that were being spent were directed almost entirely towards genetics. And I said, this has to be an environmental problem. And of course, I focused on the vaccines actually pretty much for the first 5 years of searching. It's ever since 2006 that I've been obsessed with understanding, trying to figure out what's causing the autism epidemic. I think it is a huge crisis. And I don't understand why the government doesn't appreciate that. Because when you look at the cost of a single autistic child and an autistic adult, which of course we're going to have many autistic adults coming up soon because the first wave is growing up, the burden on society is going to be not sustainable. Predictions say it's going to cost more than how much we spend on the military. Not too far into the future, taking into consideration the economic loss due to all these autistic people is going to exceed the government's expenditures on the military. So that is really, really disturbing, just from a financial standpoint. Of course, you think of all the mothers too who have children who are never going to grow up, always going to be dependent. and the enormous effort that goes into just keeping them happy as much as you can. I mean, I feel great sympathy for those moms.
Yeah, it's a
And
tragedy.
I just think we've got to end the madness. We've got to end it. And I believe I'm getting tremendous progress in identifying what's causing it. And of course, it is a complicated story, but
Yeah,
glyphosate is center.
I want to get into the ways in which you're delving into that in a second. But just for our listeners, some of whom might not have an autistic child or not be touched by autism, although those numbers of people are dwindling, right? I mean, with what is it, like 1 in 32 males now with a diagnosis.
Yeah,
It's hard to find someone who doesn't have someone in their family or who hasn't been touched in some way by autism. But what do you see as the connection between the autistic population and those people who are hurt in that way, and the other people who are maybe not autistic, but they're struggling with neurological issues or autoimmune problems, or they've got chronic Lyme? How would you make that connection to them so this feels more relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of it, all of it is connected to our toxic society, and we, it really has a lot to do with the way food is being grown in this country. I think that's at the core of it, is the toxic food, and a critical toxic chemical in the food is glyphosate. I think glyphosate is way underestimated in terms of its contribution to the mess that we're in today, and I see how glyphosate can, all by itself, cause autoimmune disease. And of course, autoimmune disease is an epidemic as well, just in general, not just autism, but all the other autoimmune diseases are all generally going up in our society. And of course, Lyme disease is one that's just gone crazy. And I just think glyphosate has a unique mechanism of toxicity that people don't appreciate, or that people even deny. And I'm just very confident that I'm right about that. And that's been my passion, is to understand that mechanism of toxicity and the implications of it. And that's what my book is about too. My book really focuses on glyphosate's unique ability to cause all these diseases. Of course, it is matching. All these diseases are going up dramatically, exactly in step with the dramatic rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. And people say, oh, you can ignore that because correlation doesn't mean causation, and because one chemical couldn't possibly cause so many things. I mean, that's just denial. If you say, yes, it is causing all those things, how could it be that it's happening? Then you can explain it. And then once you explain it, you say, oh my God, it's going to be game over if we don't straighten this up soon. I feel it's an incredible urgency that we face right now.
Yeah, agreed. And you do have some really interesting kind of what could the mechanisms be for that? And I want to get into those in a second. But first, for the listeners who might not understand, have heard the word glyphosate before, can you give us kind of a quick background, and then we'll delve into how it might cause human harm?
Yeah, so glyphosate is the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide Roundup. And I think many people are familiar with Roundup, or have even used Roundup in their lawns, to kill the weeds. Glyphosate is supposed to be a fantastic herbicide because it kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it. That's the GMO Roundup Ready crops. And it's completely harmless to humans, almost completely harmless to humans. That's the message we're hearing. So it's not even regulated. People can just go down and buy it and use it in front of their kids. They can spray it on their lawn. No problem. That's how safe it is. And so people have acquired a sort of natural instinct that Roundup is safe. And so they don't worry about it. And therefore they use it carelessly, and they get exposures that they don't realize are important. And then it's all over the food supply, which is really crucial because everybody's being poisoned by the food. And some people are measuring glyphosate and finding high levels of glyphosate in certain foods. The U.S. government doesn't care. They don't measure. They don't know. They don't care. It's like it's safe, so it doesn't matter. Sure, it's in the food. It doesn't matter. That's their attitude.
Mm-hmm. And what is the evidence that it's not safe?
Well, there's lots and lots, and there's a growing number of papers that are showing up recently that are really finding astonishing results. Now that chemists realize that it might be toxic, I think a lot more experiments are being done. So it's kind of like, oh yeah, glyphosate safe. So when they would see a problem with the birds, there's a paper where they measured all these different chemicals and toxic metals and looking for what could be causing this bird beak problem around the Great Lakes. This paper had a detailed discussion of all these things, didn't mention glyphosate, even though glyphosate was the one thing that had gone up dramatically in step with the dramatic rise in this problem in the birds. To me, it's like, of course, glyphosate's the first thing you look at. But no, it can't be glyphosate, that's safe. So once you are in denial about it being toxic, you're not going to waste money studying something that's not going to show anything. you know? And of
Is
course,
it,
the Monsanto is not going to do it.
right. Is it typical though for scientists not associated with Monsanto to have such blinders on?
Well, it's unusual. And I think part of it is because if you do go after Monsanto's products, you're going to pay a huge price in terms of your prestige in the society, because Monsanto will do a good job of trying to discredit you. You know, papers get retracted. And Monsanto works really hard to discourage people from studying glyphosate. It's their cash cow, you know. They don't want anybody to believe that it's not safe, and they work very hard to maintain that misinformation.
And how is it that you've managed to avoid getting backlash from Monsanto, or have you?
I haven't. If you look for me on the web, you'll find all kinds of stuff saying that I'm a quack or a crazy person or whatever, you know. They certainly want people to believe that I'm not credible.
Yeah.
And they'll also say I don't have the background. I mean, I don't have a education in toxicology, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, so I listened to your interview with Scott Forsgren recently, which really gets into the nitty gritty of glyphosate. And I don't want to replicate that here, but for the listening audience who might want some suggestions for how to avoid glyphosate before we get into our sulfur conversation, what are your sort of top recommendations for people who want to either detox from glyphosate, test glyphosate, avoid glyphosate? How do you do that?
Yeah, now, so the really good news is that the U.S. does have a certified organic label that is pretty good, I think. You know, and it's not perfect, but if you cannot get a certified organic label unless you do not use glyphosate. So you have to not use glyphosate on your crops in order to get that label. And so what's happening when people measure is that certified organic foods are coming up with much less glyphosate, not zero, not always zero, sometimes zero. Sometimes they're contaminated, but not because the person used it, but because it's everywhere. It's in the rain, you know, it's in the manure. I mean, you cannot avoid it. So the organic foods have a lot less. And sometimes it's substantially less, like, you know, factor of 10 less, that type of thing. It's typical, I think. So if you eat certified organic in all the foods that you buy, you will reduce your glyphosate burden by quite a bit. And certainly I practice an organic diet, and I would encourage everybody listening to do so, because that's an easy thing to do. It'll cost you a little more money and a little more time to shop, but you will get it all back in terms of your family's health. You know, their health is going to be so much better because of you. And also the organic foods are more nutritious for the reason that glyphosate disrupts the food's ability to produce nutritious products, you know. So the foods that are exposed to glyphosate come from plants that are also deficient in their nutritional value. So you get better nutrition on top of avoiding the chemical. And of course, the other chemicals too, all the insecticides, the fungicides, all those things cannot be used. Those chemical-based poisons cannot be used in organic agriculture. So I think we need to have everybody get on board with the idea of buying only certified organic food, and that will also push the farmers into growing it. So it's a win-win situation all around.
Yeah. And what about the fact of the rainwater contamination with glyphosate? I mean, how do you wash your vegetables and fruits, for example, to make sure they're washed clean of whatever might have fallen on them as rain?
Well, I mean, it's not just falling on them as rain. It gets soaked up from the rain and gets incorporated into the tissue. So you cannot remove the glyphosate that got into the plant from the rain. The plant takes up that glyphosate from the rain and puts it into its own tissue so that you can't wash it off. You know, you just can't. There's, you know, a lot of rain doesn't have glyphosate. So, I mean, I think there was a study in Kentucky that showed something like 70 or 80% of the rain samples were contaminated. So it's very high in Kentucky. Now, who knows about other places, you know. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of studying about the levels of glyphosate in the rain.
Right.
But, yeah.
How about
but the general
meat?
thing is eat organic.
Sorry. How about meat?
Yeah.
Do animals incorporate this into their tissue and flesh in the same way? And is it a more or less concentrated form of glyphosate than you'd get in a plant?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is not really known because, as I said, the government hasn't been measuring, so most people don't really, even the researchers don't really know. But Monsanto did research early on where they fed radio-labeled glyphosate to animals. And then they looked in the tissues and they found the radio label all over the tissues. And the highest levels, I think, were found in the bone marrow. So high levels in the lungs of cows. I mean, so it's it gets into the tissues. That's part of its toxic mechanism. They actually assure you that it comes right through and all of it leaves. Monsanto will tell you that. It comes in quick, it goes out quickly through the feces, through the urine, it disappears, it breaks down, it's like it's a great chemical because it doesn't accumulate. But in fact, they know it accumulates because they found accumulation in the tissues. And other people have found that too. So, there was a study on pigs. They looked at deformed piglets that were not viable. They had major deformities, and they found glyphosate. They looked in several different tissue samples from those piglets, and they found glyphosate in all of them. The lungs, the kidneys, the heart. I mean, just basically all over the body.
And you've talked many times about the way in which you believe it incorporates, actually, it substitutes for one of our amino acids, glycine, I believe it is, and it sort of swaps out for glycine. Yes. Why would our bodies want to incorporate glyphosate over glycine? Is it a matter of, are we glycine deficient? If we put more glycine in, does it actually push glyphosate out?
I mean, some of the practitioners have suggested that taking glycine as a supplement is a good idea to help to reduce the amount of glyphosate that goes into your proteins. And I think that may be a good idea to make sure you have plenty of glycine. The problem is, and it's interesting because it's very interesting biology, but it only can fit in certain places. So glyphosate is a complete glycine molecule, except that it has an extra bulky thing stuck onto its nitrogen atom. That's what makes it different from glycine. Otherwise, it's an amino acid. It's an amino acid analog of glycine. And the reason why it's not glycine is because it has extra stuff on its nitrogen atom. And that extra stuff needs to find room. So in a protein where the glycine residue is crowded by bigger amino acids nearby, it won't fit and it won't go in. The places where it's ideal is in proteins that bind phosphate, because glyphosate's extra piece is a methylphosphonate unit, which looks a lot like phosphate. So it sort of will fit well in a spot where the protein intends to bind phosphate. And then the protein intends the phosphate to come in and fit into that spot as a substrate. But because the glyphosate's there, it can't do it. And that's why the protein doesn't work. And that's exactly what goes on with the protein that glyphosate famously disrupts in the shikimate pathway, which is called EPSP synthase. That protein binds phosphate at a place where glyphosate substitutes for a highly conserved glycine residue that blocks the phosphate from binding and prevents that protein from doing its job.
And what does the shikimate pathway end up creating that we're missing if we have glyphosate on board?
Good question. And that is, I think, a key piece of the puzzle for its toxicity, immediate toxicity in the gut microbes, because the gut microbes have the shikimate pathway and they use it to produce those products, which are the aromatic amino acids. Those are 3 of the coding amino acids. There's about 20 coding amino acids that are very famous in biology as being the critical building blocks of proteins, and proteins are the workhorses of the body. So super, super important, those 20 amino acids. Glycine is one of them, and glyphosate disrupts it big time. And then there are those aromatic amino acids that come out of the shikimate pathway. Glyphosate messes up both the plants and the microbes' ability to make those aromatic amino acids. Our cells are incapable of making those products because we don't have that pathway. And Monsanto says that's why it's safe, because we don't have a pathway. How could it affect us? But they're overlooking the fact that it's affecting our gut microbes big time and disrupting the balance of microbes in the gut and preventing the microbes from producing critical nutrients. Those aromatics go into the proteins, but not only that, they're precursors to a whole bunch of things, including all the neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, the skin tanning agent melanin, thyroid hormone, folate, niacin. These are all coming out of that shikimate pathway, and they're going to be depleted, insufficient. And so serotonin deficiency is something that's linked to violent behavior, obesity, depression. Those are all linked to serotonin deficiency, just that one alone, which comes directly from the tryptophan that comes from the shikimate pathway.
Wow. So many, just a multifaceted array of things that get disrupted because our microbiome's not happy, because we're killing the microbiome by blocking the shikimate pathway, which they need to survive. And byproducts of those which we need to survive healthfully, happily, are also getting blocked as a result. So Monsanto is saying it's safe because we don't have the shikimate pathway as human beings, even though 90% of our cells are not human cells.
I know. That's something that's really quite sobering, isn't it?
Yeah. how about the mitochondria, who are kind of like little bacteria floating around making our energy for us? Do they use the shikimate pathway, or are they disrupted by glyphosate in any way?
Not through the shikimate pathway directly, but indirectly, and also through other pathways as well. I believe the mitochondria are really hit hard by glyphosate. And that's been shown in some studies too, because they've shown that glyphosate causes mitochondrial stress and causes what they call reactive oxygen species. And those are ROS, which damage the mitochondria. I'm, it's a much more complicated story to get into exactly how it happens, but I believe that glyphosate is a major disruptor of the mitochondria. One of the things is an enzyme called succinate dehydrogenase, which is a crucial enzyme in the mitochondrial citric acid cycle. And glyphosate has been shown experimentally to suppress that enzyme. And if that enzyme is not working, the mitochondria really get in trouble with respect to producing ATP. And producing ATP is like providing energy to the cell. So the mitochondria have trouble providing energy to the cell because of glyphosate disrupting that enzyme. But there's other ways as well that glyphosate's disrupting the mitochondria. I think they're hit very hard by glyphosate.
Well, if you're thinking about all the different cofactors and neurotransmitters and different minerals that are being affected and impacted by glyphosate, then all those feed directly into the mitochondria, right? To sort of power up its ability to make energy through ATP formation. So I can't imagine why they wouldn't be impacted. Yeah, which would go a long way toward explaining sort of the chronic fatiguing illnesses that people suffer from, and the poor exercise tolerance, just mitochondria pooped out basically.
Yes, and in fact, there's an enzyme called PEPCK, which I talk a lot about in my book, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. That enzyme is very, very interesting because it binds a phosphate. In fact, it binds PEP, which is the same molecule that EPSP synthase binds. So glyphosate disrupts EPSP synthase through blocking PEP binding. And if PEP can't bind in PEPCK, it's going to also be in trouble just the same way as EPSP synthase. In other words, the model that already exists for the enzyme that glyphosate blocks in the plants is exactly a fit to the PEPCK. So you can predict that glyphosate would also disrupt that enzyme in the same way. It has a highly conserved glycine at the site where the PEP binds. It has exactly the same setup, basically, as the EPSP synthase. So you can predict that glyphosate would disrupt that enzyme. And if it does, it has huge implications in terms of many different conditions, including in the infant, infantile hypoglycemia, which is kids can go into a coma because they get too little sugar in their blood. PEPCK critically manages blood sugar. It promotes gluconeogenesis, which is the synthesis of sugar from other things. If it's broken, the mitochondria get bogged down because intermediates in the mitochondria build up, and they can't. The whole machinery gets bogged down, and you can't digest fats. You can't easily metabolize fats, and other substrates like lactate into the mitochondria. So you start depending too much on sugar compared to other nutrients as a source of energy. And that will probably force you to eat a high sugar diet because you can't really metabolize the fats very well,
Wow.
So you tend to pig out on carbs, and your fat cells are storing fat because it's not able to be. All kinds of things make sense if PEPCK is being disrupted by glyphosate.
Wow. So that's sort of a hypothesis, a working hypothesis right now. Is anyone studying that? Anyone actually looking at that molecule?
Yeah, just me, actually. I haven't seen any papers that specifically mention PEPCK, although they have shown in multiple studies, both with rats and with humans, that glyphosate causes fatty liver disease, even at minute amounts. So levels below regulatory limits exposed to rats cause fatty liver disease. And they cause the liver to produce metabolites that are completely consistent, including the fatty liver disease, with PEPCK disruption. So if you disrupt PEPCK, you get exactly the profile that you see when the liver is exposed to glyphosate. So that makes tremendous sense. Somebody needs to actually look specifically at PEPCK, but nobody has done that yet.
Incredible. There's a whole vegetable soup here that I would love to dig in and follow those pathways. I'm sort of hesitant to, though. I think it might be overwhelming for some people. And I really want to steer us back to sulfur because some of the things we talked about earlier about sulfur are very actionable things that people can do every day to increase. But first, let's make a connection, will you please, between glyphosate and sulfur and explain why sulfur matters.
Yeah, well, first of all, glyphosate disrupts the synthesis of those aromatic amino acids. And as I said, those are precursors to serotonin and all those other neurotransmitters. All of those neurotransmitters are sulfated in transit before they're shipped out. Like the gut produces most of the serotonin in the body, and then it's shipped out with a sulfate attached to it, and then it goes to the brain. And I think it's delivering sulfate to the brain. Sulfate deficiency is strongly linked to autism, and particularly heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles is linked to autism. And I believe that's because the brain is not being supplied with adequate amounts of sulfate. And that's partly because the sulfate carriers are not being produced in adequate amounts. All those things coming out of the shikimate path carry sulfate. There's another path to carry sulfate, which is through cholesterol and vitamin D and all kinds of sterols. So there's steroid hormones. Glyphosate has been shown to severely disrupt the adrenal gland's ability. This has been shown experimentally to severely disrupt the adrenal gland's ability to produce steroid hormones. And so those also, DHEA sulfate, for example, and testosterone sulfate, estrogen sulfate, all those things those are the sex hormones. All of them are sulfated in transit. I believe that those sulfated molecules play an important role in distributing sulfate through the body. And so sulfate distribution becomes severely impaired because of glyphosate's disruption. I believe glyphosate is disrupting also sulfide oxidase, the enzyme sulfide oxidase in the gut, which is critical for making sulfate out of reduced sulfur sources. So when you eat garlic, for example, or onions, and if you have an issue, some people have a sulfur sensitivity issue, I think that's directly tied to glyphosate exposure, because glyphosate is preventing your gut from producing sulfate from those sulfur sources. And so instead you get an overgrowth of bacteria that reduce sulfur to hydrogen sulfide gas. So you have hydrogen sulfide gas building up in the gut, which causes a lot of discomfort. And that prevents you from eating sulfur containing foods, which gets you into a downward spiral with respect to sulfate deficiency.
Wow. My head just exploded a little bit with that. Because then we're getting into things like SIBO and people's sort of, reactivity to foods, certain foods that are actually supposed to be healthy for them. But what it sounds like is it's just a vicious cycle that gets worse and worse with those foods that should keep you well and help you overcome those problems.
Yeah, you've got barriers that prevent you from using sulfur correctly, and therefore you're disinclined to eat sulfur for good reason. But that's eventually going to bite you back because of the deficiencies systemically in sulfate, which is going to cause huge problems.
So other than eating sulfur-containing, sulfur-rich foods, what are some other ways people can increase sulfur in their diet or in their bodies?
Well, one thing I recommend is Epsom salts. I actually am quite fond of Epsom salts myself. It's one thing I use routinely. It's very easy. Just throw a few Epsom salts into the bath water, make a hot bath. I like to use something as hot as you can stand. So you get infrared heat as well as the sulfate, magnesium and sulfate. Magnesium is good too, because that's another one that glyphosate messes up. So you get magnesium sulfate absorbed through the skin, which bypasses the gut, so that you don't, if you have gut issues especially, it'd be a really good thing to do is just soak in Epsom salt baths. And of course, if you can find a sulfur hot springs, that's probably even better because that's so natural. So I really like sulfur hot springs. I think that's a really good, generally a good area, a good thing to do.
And you would recommend, you said throw a few Epsom salts. So is that a few cups? Do you have a few bags? A few pounds? How much? I
just usually use about, maybe I sort of just toss it in. I think it's about a half a cup or something like that, just enough so it can dissolve easily in the bath water. Mm-hmm. You know, if you put too much, it just waste it because it won't dissolve. So you sort of shake it around, and yeah, it's pretty easy. And just do that as a almost routine basis, several times a week. I mean, it's not gonna hurt you. I mean, it's very safe. And glyphosate disrupts minerals in general. Lots of minerals are getting disrupted because it binds very tightly to them. That's another thing that it does, because it has this negative charge. So it's very attracted to minerals. It's a chelator. It's called a metal chelator. And that's causing a lot of trouble with our mineral balance in the body. And a lot of our enzymes depend critically on certain minerals like zinc and manganese and magnesium. And those are becoming unavailable because the glyphosate's tying them up. And that's hurting the gut bacteria as well.
Yeah. And are you also of the mind that we can't really get all of our minerals anymore from plants and animals? We sort of have to supplement some of them?
Yeah, well, I do think that the foods are very depleted. And that's partly because of the glyphosate. It's been shown in studies that glyphosate severely disrupts the plant's ability to take up, all kinds of important minerals. So when you eat a piece of a food, a vegetable or a fruit, it's got much less of those minerals in it if it's been exposed to glyphosate than it should have. So you're not getting enough minerals in your supplements. Certainly you want to use sea salt rather than table salt. That's because you can get minerals in your salt. And I'm very fond of organic beef broth. We actually, my husband actually makes a soup on a regular basis. He makes a big pot of soup from beef bones and whatnot, chicken bones, beef bones, throw them into the pot, cook a long time. You pull the minerals out of the bone, and that gives you a really good mineral supplement that way.
Now, what are the risks of pulling glyphosate out of those bones?
Well, organic, you hope it's going to be less, but no, you can't guarantee there isn't glyphosate there as well, especially because there's high levels of glycine in bone. Bone has a lot of collagen, and collagen is loaded with glycine. Long stretches of collagen have every third amino acid is a glycine. There's a pattern, GXY, GXY, GXY. So you've got lots and lots of opportunities for glyphosate to substitute for glycine in collagen. I actually think that's why we have an epidemic in joint pain and all kinds of issues with arthritis and shoulder, knee problems, shoulder problems, all the back problems, which are legion right now. So many people are suffering from back problems. I suspect that glyphosate substitution for glycine in collagen is a major player in those problems, in the epidemic.
Yeah, there's like nothing that it doesn't do.
I know, it's really quite an amazing molecule.
It's really good at what it does, which is a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah, it's actually a really good way to understand how life works, I'm finding. I think glyphosate is a good window on life because of everything it disrupts. We didn't notice that the gut microbes were so important until glyphosate started disrupting them. When you look back 20, 30 years, there were very few papers on the gut microbiome. It was simply working, and so we didn't pay any attention. Now that it's not working, all these papers are coming out that are showing us, oh my God, they're broken in this way and that way and the other way, Everyone's talking about gut dysbiosis and leaky gut. I mean, all of that's being set up by glyphosate.
Do you ever, long for the old days is, of course we do, but do you ever get really demoralized? Like I sometimes
Yes.
feel a little overwhelmed by this, but you seem to be just in every interview I've heard and just speaking to you every time we've talked, I just feel like you have such kind of a can-do spirit about it and it doesn't seem to get you down. Do you ever get down from it all?
I do. I try to stay upbeat, and when I'm in presentation, I always try to keep an upbeat attitude. But yes, I feel. Sometimes I actually feel so down that it's like maybe it would be better if the people disappeared. Like if we could just make ourselves extinct before we kill off everything else, maybe that would be a good thing for the earth at large. That's how depressing it gets, and I don't believe that. I'm hoping that there will be enough of us who recognize what's happening, who decide they have to change their ways. I see people in agriculture who are making tremendous strides in understanding how to clear the glyphosate, how to heal the soil, and how to grow nutritious food. And then they're passionate about doing that. And those people are going to save us. I hope. I hope we're going to be saved by them rather than just go down the tubes with this horrendous. We have made a huge mistake in the way we grow food over the past probably close to 100 years at this point. It's really started with World War I, and the toxic chemicals came out of World War I, and the understanding of how to make nitrate fertilizers chemically. That was supposedly a big breakthrough because then they could just pour these chemically derived nitrate fertilizers over all the crops. And you got to the point where your crops, you maybe could increase yield, but you were decreasing value. So your food became less nutritious. As a consequence of this industrial-based approach, but you got more of it cheaply, so that seemed like a good idea. And we've just embraced this kind of chemical-based agriculture for way, way, way too long. We need to understand it's not going to work. It's ruining the soil. It's actually contributing to climate change, probably in a more substantial way than we realize, I suspect. Just the agriculture, the way we grow food, is hurting us in terms of climate change, which of course is the other existential threat that we face.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so important for us to reverse, and I'm just hoping that it will catch on like wildfire. Once enough people find out and realize the benefits and become on board, it's going to grow it's just going to be mushroom out, because I think more and more people will wake up and realize we have to change our ways. And then they're going to feel gratified that they can be healthy, and happy and strong and really, there's so much to gain. And by denying industrial-based agriculture, there's so much to gain. We just can't be stupid enough not to do that. Eventually, once enough people wake up.
Hmm. Hmm. What do you think? So there'll be some people who listen to this and say, you know, all I can manage to do is just buy organic. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on me. I'm going to try to heal my own gut. And then there are going to be people who are already doing that or who are ready for next steps. What are some of the things that you're doing either locally or nationally or, you know, as an advocate for this? And how might people get involved if they wanted to?
People can get involved politically if they can stomach that. I mean, that's a hard place to go, but politically you can make a difference, particularly locally. And I feel encouraged by how many different cities and counties across the country are making a difference. They're just individually banning glyphosate, you know, just in the city, in the county, public use on the schoolyards. For example, Hawaii recently passed a law that you could not use glyphosate on the schoolyards, all the public schools, no glyphosate. So, I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. Children, you know, you don't want to expose children to glyphosate, but they're using glyphosate on schoolyards around the country. That's something a parent could get into. I'm going to go talk to my local government. I'm going to say, look, you cannot use glyphosate on my child's schoolyard. You need to pass a law, right? And those things can happen locally because Monsanto can't control everybody. Monsanto dumps huge amounts of money into the highest level of government. You know, so not even just the United States, but even above the country level in these, you know, these agreements that they make, these trans-Pacific, you know, and transatlantic agreements that are that actually restrict countries sometimes from being able to have the right to, for example, ban glyphosate. Like Austria banned glyphosate recently, and then there was some kind of pushback about, oh no, you can't do that. I mean, because you've signed this agreement, you know. So they're building these coalitions that are above the country level. And then the companies control them to prevent people from being able to regulate themselves. This went on in Hawaii. Hawaii had a whole bunch of bills that were done at the county level, different counties within the Hawaii state, and they passed laws that would restrict herbicides and restrict chemicals in general. And then the state would tell the county, you can't do that. That's something only the state can do. You know, so those laws became useless. I mean, it's incredible how they know the strategy is you disenfranchise the little guys and then you control the top. That's how the whole system works. And the industry has tons of money. So they pour the money into the top and they get all those people on board. You look at President Trump, he's completely uninterested in any kind of regulation. He's trying to reverse what's already there. You know, it's just like they manage to make sure that the people in power stay in power and also that they're well fed, you know, well supplied with money so that they won't want to go against Monsanto's wishes. So that's what's very discouraging politically, but you can have a lot of power locally, I think, at the political level, and people need to do that. And even, of course, you know, if you can have people, big marches at the State House and that sort of thing, you know, have people really gather and protest and hold signs and stuff like that. People could really do that and get energized to help spread the message, really get people aware of the problems we face.
Yeah. And I'm imagining you've done that. You've done that partly in Hawaii, right? You've seen some change at your local
Absolutely.
level, despite
I was certainly very much involved.
Yeah.
And also I've met with the people in the State House in Boston, and I gave a talk down in Pennsylvania at the legislature. So I've done some of that. It's very, very disheartening because you feel so frustrated that they're not listening. We went down to Washington, D.C., a group of us, actually about 10 of us went down to Washington, D.C. and presented to the congressional, it wasn't the Congress people, but it was the people who support them. And they were quite attentive. And then we went to the EPA and they were just like, why do I have to be here? I mean, couldn't wait to get out of here. They were completely non-responsive. It was so disappointing. We tried to present at the EPA and they basically tried to use up the time so we couldn't present, and then they just didn't even ask any questions. It just like stonewalled us. I mean, it was a very disappointing experience, and we didn't see anything come out of that was at all useful. So a lot of us spent our own money to get there and everything, and it just didn't make a difference. You know, it's very discouraging. As Zen Honeycutt has had, you know, Zen Honeycutt of Moms Across America, I really admire her.
Yeah.
And she has had I think she really had some impact. And she just goes to the government and she says, you can't do this. I mean, she's very out there. Very bold and brave, and we need more people like her, because I get easily discouraged by the government, and I just feel like more inclined to want to do it socially and through motivating individuals to make a difference one by one through their pocketbook, you know, And I think that's a nicer, more fun way to do it. Just say, go buy organic, not just for yourself, but for the country, you know, to force people to make organic food rather than to, if you don't buy the toxic food, they won't make it. If they can't sell it, they won't make it.
Right. Well, there
And
are
I
whole
think that's
countries,
very,
there are
very
whole
empowering.
countries that have outlawed GMOs and Monsanto, I believe, like whole countries.
There's a growing number. Yeah, Austria. And in fact, I heard that Luxembourg just did. Luxembourg is going to get rid of glyphosate by the end of 2020. That's coming right up. And Germany is planning to phase it out by 2023. I think Austria banned it outright. And then I think there's been some pushback. Vietnam banned glyphosate. Sri Lanka banned it for a while. I think they might have brought it back. El Salvador. I mean, there's several countries. And I think Bermuda, I'm not sure, but I think Bermuda has banned it for quite some time. They may have been the first. A tiny little country in the middle of the Atlantic, you know, but they care about their corals. So.
Yeah, and I'm so interested in the story of someone who banned it and then brought it back. Like, what's that? What's that about?
Well, the farmers' pressure. I mean, Sri Lanka has had a really stormy thing with glyphosate because they have this huge problem with kidney failure among their agricultural workers. And they have researchers. One of the people I've collaborated with him, Sarath Ganatilake, he has quite a name, but he's a Sri Lankan, native Sri Lankan, who's now a professor in California. And he and I just published a paper together along with Laura Orlando. So three of us published a paper discussing this whole idea of glyphosate causing this kidney failure. There's these agricultural workers in Sri Lanka, as well as in Central America, who are dying in record numbers in their 40s from kidney failure. That's a peculiar kind of kidney failure that's not normal, not like what you see with diabetes, for example. And there's been lots of papers written, and the industry has tried very hard to steer people away from the toxic chemicals as being the problem. But it's very clear that glyphosate, first of all, they're highly exposed to glyphosate. And secondly, especially if you look at the glycine analog situation, you can see how glyphosate would cause exactly the problem that you see with their kidneys. It could be caused by glyphosate messing up proteins through substitution for glycine. So, and we wrote about that in the paper that was recently published.
So this gets me back.
So Sri Lanka is actually believes that glyphosate. The Sri Lankan government believes that glyphosate is causing their kidney failure problem, and that's why they banned it. But then the farmers sort of said, "Oh, we can't do without it. You know, we have to have it." And so I think I'm not sure where the status is right now with Sri Lanka, but they ban it and then they get it on the black market and stuff like that. So it's not really gone. But yeah.
So thinking about this, the whole glycine substitution and you know, our internal systems and our tissues that are essentially tainted with glyphosate, it always brings me back to, well, what can be done for what's already happened? I mean, we can stop buying food we can start buying organic and food that's more tainted than not. And what about the stuff that's in there? What would you recommend for people besides Epsom salts to sort of for people who can tolerate sulfur and anything else to detox from glyphosate? What's available?
Yeah, and sort of getting enough sulfur is important because that helps you to break down proteins. And one of the things that happens is you get glyphosate contaminated proteins that are hard to break down. And that's part of what's giving you all the autoimmune disease, because these proteins are immunogenic. And for example, gluten intolerance is a direct consequence of glyphosate messing up the ability to break down the gluten proteins, as well as its ability to mess up an enzyme that causes the gluten to be much more allergenic. So I've written a whole paper on celiac, and I'm working on another paper right now on celiac disease. It's so perfect. I know glyphosate. I feel very confident I'm right that glyphosate is the reason why we have an epidemic in celiac disease, but the protein's not getting broken down. There are ways, now I've been looking at ways to actually remove glyphosate, and there are some interesting things out there that practitioners are finding are helpful, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how they work. One thing is fulvic acid and humic acid. Those are complex organic molecules in the soil. It's like organic, the organic component of the soil, which is also being destroyed by glyphosate, but those molecules are quite interesting, and they're apparently able to bind to chemicals and take them out through the feces. Possibly even they bind enzymes that can break glyphosate down. That's not clear yet. That's, again, something that needs to be more looked into. But it is known that fulvic acid and humic acid bind very versatile enzymes that are able to break down various toxic chemicals. So whether glyphosate's one of them or not, it's not clear. Glyphosate's hard to break down, and there are some microbes that can break it down as well. And some of them, I suspect, are causing the reason why we're seeing people getting infected with these microbes to the point of having disease is because they're breaking down the glyphosate. Something like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, they can fully metabolize glyphosate. And they're a problem in the hospitals right now. There's a real big problem with Pseudomonas infection causing, and especially multiple antibiotic resistant Pseudomonas causing various problems. They may be doing a major service to the host by removing the glyphosate, which is, I think, quite interesting to think about. Acetobacter is another one. There have been some species of Acetobacter that have been shown to be able to break down glyphosate. I'm sort of hopeful that that's the case for apple cider vinegar. So I personally like to eat organic apple cider vinegar on a regular basis, with the hope that the microbes in it can break down glyphosate. And that has, again, not been proven, but it's just possible. It's possible. So, and that might be one of the benefits of probiotics in general, is to get, if you could get your gut, if you could get established in your gut some kind of microbe that can break down glyphosate that doesn't harm you, you'd be in Fat City, because that microbe would really help to clear the glyphosate that you're exposed to.
So not Pseudomonas, for example, but maybe more of the Acetobacter.
Well, Pseudomonas causes disease, but Acetobacter doesn't. So if you can find a microbe that is a happy spot where it doesn't hurt you, but also breaks down the glyphosate, it would be so sweet. So I suspect some people may be less susceptible simply because they have some kind of microbe in their gut that's doing that for them, and other people don't. So that really makes a big difference in terms of how toxic the glyphosate is for you. And even in your mouth, like you could just have these microbes growing in your mouth that could clear the glyphosate before it even gets into your gut, which would be really super. So that's something that I think people are researching. And hopefully we can get some answers like that. The other thing that's interesting is chlorine dioxide, and that's a very controversial topic. I don't know if you've heard of chlorine dioxide.
Oh yeah, I've used chlorine dioxide and found it to be very, very effective for Lyme, and we will actually have someone on one of our talks talking about it. So yeah, absolutely, I'm a fan. But go on, tell us more.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's extremely interesting. And I got to know Carrie Rivera. I really like her. Carrie Rivera is a practitioner who treats autism around the world. She's treated thousands of kids. She's reversed autism in over 500, maybe 550 and counting. So she's very, very excited about her treatment protocol, which I think is outstanding. And a critical piece of it is chlorine dioxide. And she has gotten into tremendous trouble because of it, because the US government is really determined to make sure that people believe that chlorine dioxide is incredibly toxic, which is simply not true. I've looked at the data, for example, in the FARS database, FDA's adverse event reporting system, where they report people's reactions to various drugs. And I looked at, I just picked the year 2017, and I was specifically interested in the chlorine dioxide and also drugs that are prescribed for autistic kids. And there are these antipsychotic drugs that are allowed, they're permitted for autism, sort of like the industry decided these drugs are useful for treating anxiety behaviors in autistic kids. And these drugs are used very widely on the autistic kids, and they're very, very toxic. I mean, it was just amazing. I found tens of thousands of just in the 1 year of cases where one of these antipsychotic drugs had some kind of severe reaction in a patient who was taking them. And whereas the chlorine dioxide almost didn't show up at all. And if it did show up, it was one of the other drugs they were taking. It wasn't even targeted as the one that was causing the problem. So, it's just, there's an incredible difference between the toxicity of chlorine dioxide and the toxicity of drugs that are routinely given to autistic kids without even thinking about it. So the world is really very upside down. It doesn't make sense that chlorine dioxide should be so, you become so afraid to take this because the government's told you that it's incredibly toxic, and it's just not true.
Right.
So what it does, I think it's very interesting. I think I've been looking into it, and I think there's at least 3 things I can think of. And one is potentially is breaking down glyphosate, because it's been shown actually in studies that chlorine dioxide does break down glyphosate. It's not nearly as effective as chlorine by itself. And chlorine is what's typically used in our water treatment plants. And thank God it's being used. Chlorine is used to kill the microbes, but it also kills the glyphosate, which is so super, because otherwise we'd have a huge problem with glyphosate in our water. And I think the reason why we don't, I believe the food is a much bigger source than the water for most people. And the reason is because the chlorine is being used in the water. And the chlorine, of course, is bad for you. It does cause these organic, dangerous organic molecules that come out of the chlorine reaction with chlorine. Chlorine dioxide does not. It's a very big difference between just, sodium chloride is salt. So just because there's chlorine doesn't mean it's toxic. Sodium chloride, we don't avoid sodium chloride because it's toxic, you know? So it depends on what's with the chlorine as far as how it reacts. And chlorine dioxide is very interesting because it does not react with organic matter. That's the problem with chlorine. Chlorine dioxide does not have that problem. But on the other hand, chlorine dioxide produces hypochlorite. And I think, in fact, it enables the macrophages, the immune cells of the body. Chlorine dioxide enables them to produce hypochlorite, which is what they do normally when they're fighting infection. So it's helping them to fight infection. It's giving assistance to the macrophages, to the immune cells to fight the infection. So that's helping to straighten out the gut and clear the pathogens. And so, and then it oxidizes sulfur. It's so cool because chlorine dioxide specifically oxidizes sulfur. And that is absolutely super because it can help to make sulfate. And of course, the sulfate, making sulfate is blocked by glyphosate because of the sulfide oxidase problem. So I think that chlorine dioxide can help the body to renew their sulfate supplies, break down the glyphosate, and then help the immune cells to fight off the microbes. Those are all three very good things that it does.
It's almost sounding like an antidote.
Yes, I think it's actually, I hope that it's going to become very, very popular once the government finally recognizes that it's not really toxic. The problem with it is that it's cheap, it's not patentable, it works, you know, that's all terrifying to the pharmaceutical industry. It's really sad that they fight the things that are actually so beneficial, you know, and so economical. It's just ridiculous. So we need to fight back. I mean, they're making it sound so horrible that most people are scared away when they consider using it. They're scared away.
Yeah. And meanwhile, it's the most important thing in my medicine cabinet. You know, the most.
Excellent. That's really good to hear. I'm glad. I love to hear testimonials from people like you because it really helps me to believe that it is, in fact, very, very good, as it looks like it should be, just when you consider chemically.
Yeah. I mean, and it's used, I mean, there were a lot of papers that when I was writing my book and including information on chlorine dioxide, I was looking up all these papers, and there are a lot of published papers on the safety of chlorine dioxide, you know, using it to wash medical instruments, using it to even sterilize surfaces in medicine, fruits and vegetables, you know, in municipal water supplies. So we're going to do a whole talk on that. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I'm so grateful that you mentioned it because as I think about what's in our toolbox for mitigating this massive exposure to this pervasive herbicide, other than kind of going to our congressmen and going to our local school boards and doing things to kind of stop the exposure, there are things people can do just to sort of start to deactivate it and get rid of it. And that's
right. I know. I think that's really, really hopeful. And I really admire the alternative medicine practitioners who are finding these methods to help heal people who've been poisoned by glyphosate. You know, they're really making a difference.
Yeah. So what are some final things you would want every person who's come to this interview, maybe from a place of illness or desperation or fear of not being able to recover, and they've learned some new facts and information about how we're getting poisoned. They've also learned some tools to take away and maybe some lifestyle modifications that they can consider. What would you say to them from your heart?
Well, I think there's hope. And in fact, I think because a lot of the things that you can do to heal are safe, you know, eating organic food, how could you argue with that? There's nothing not safe about that. You know, the pharmaceutical industry might suggest some kind of a drug, and you can be very concerned about the side effects that that drug might cause. Organic food is not going to cause any side effects. It's only going to make you better. And another thing I didn't mention enough is getting out in the sunlight. The sunlight is absolutely free, you know, it doesn't cost anything. Just go out there and get some sun exposure, because that actually helps your body it stimulates your body to make sulfate. So I think that's super important. I really am a sun worshiper. And so that's an easy thing. Walking along the beach in the water on a sunny day, you know, is so perfect because you're getting grounding as well. And grounding is something we didn't talk about, but that's allowing you to supply electricity to your body. And the ocean air has sulfur, so you're getting sulfur by breathing it. And you know, and you've got the sunlight that's helping you to make the sulfate. So it's like a very healthy, happy thing to do is just to take a walk along the beach in the sunlight. So these are sort of all very positive things you can do that have no downside. Eating healthy food, eating sulfur-containing foods, getting the sunlight, soaking in Epsom salt baths. Those are all very, very safe and healthy things you can do to heal. And I think you'll see a difference quickly, I suspect, if you just change your lifestyle in that way.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end. And I'm so, again, so grateful for you giving us your time and sharing some of your wisdom and your just capacious intellect with us, and all of the things that you've learned and are sharing with the world are just so precious and so inspiring. So thank you again for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Healing Grove podcast. If you liked it, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to deepen your experience further, consider grabbing a copy of the Healing Grove Playbook. With journal prompts for this podcast and 41 others, it's the perfect place to record your learnings, keep track of the tools you explore, and reflect on your own experience. Finally, it's important to mention that even though I am a doctor, nothing you hear on this podcast, whether from myself or my guests, constitutes medical advice. Any intervention you try should always be discussed with and supervised by a trusted member of your own healing team. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Healing Grove.